4?
Yeah, they're cool. I was like in the middle.
You're good. Alright, let me open
Yeah,
it.
nobody knew
Talk
there
about
were
it.
I just pushed it.
So, Lexi is curious. Y'all can't see it because I didn't close out the Word or the PowerPoint. Okay, so Lexi is curious about how much sleep students at Hillcrest High School get on average, or get on a typical school night. So she asked some students in each of her classes how much sleep they think they get on average. What is the characteristic of interest? Okay? Alright. What do we think of this response?
We don't include Hillcrest High School.
Okay. Why do we not include students at Hillcrest High School?
Because that's population,
That's-
and that's the next question.
Right. So remember, there's a difference between the characteristic of interest. That's just the thing we're collecting data on. So this is something that I realized language-wise is helpful in my third block. The characteristic of interest is what data you are going to collect. The population is who you are collecting data about, or about whom you're collecting the data, right? So when I ask you what is the characteristic of interest, what data are you collecting? Typical amount of sleep, right? So and I will say this is a good detail, typical amount of sleep gotten on a school night, because do you get a different amount of sleep on the weekend versus the week? Typically, right? We might stay up later, but then get up later, so maybe it comes out evenly, but it's the amount of sleep on a school night that affects how prepared you are for school. We all good with why students at Hillcrest High School are not included there. Okay, so it's all about the data that we collect versus who it is collected for. So what is the population? Hillcrest High School students at Hillcrest High School. Be careful, can we just say Hillcrest High School?
No, because you could be talking about teachers, the janitor.
Right, if we say just Hillcrest High School, there's more than just students here, correct?
No.
Okay,
Yes.
and so we want Hillcrest High School students. Here's an important detail, it says random students in her classes. Are random students in her classes the population? Remember-
That's who she was getting her data.
What would we call the people that she's getting actual data from? The sample, right?
Okay, so we're supposed to say
I was talking
Hillcrest High
about.
School and then be more specific of student, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So it's students at Hillcrest High School, that's the population. Remember, the population is who she's trying to make a prediction about, right? Or so it's about whom you're collecting the data, is who you're trying to make a prediction about. But then when we say random students in her classes, we're talking about a sample there. We good with that? Okay?
So the sample is a more like in-depth
Specific,
version
yeah.
of the population.
It's not a more in-depth, it's a small portion of the population. It's who you so like, are you gonna collect data from every single student at Hillcrest High School?
No.
No, it's like 1,400 kids, right? So the population is every student at Hillcrest High School, but you're going to collect a sample, a small portion of that population, and we want that small sample to predict the population. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Yes, ma'am. You're good. Okay.
Are we supposed to do that? Because we're shooting.
Okay.
She's been here.
Okay. I don't have that student.
It would be in
Oh, gotcha. I got you. Sign next to the name. There we go.
Because I'm thinking,
Thank you very much.
I'm thinking Lexi's going to first one to finish
Okay.
it, and I'm kind of trying to.
So, what is the sample? What do we see up here that we think might be the clearest explanation of the actual sample?
The first one, maybe?
First one.
There's like students in her class, in each of her classes.
So remember, the sample itself is the people she's collecting data from to make the prediction. So it's the actual students that she gets the data from, so there's students in her classes. Now, can we say, well, it says asked people in all of her classes, right? So it's not everybody in her classes, it's just the students she asked. Does that make sense? Now, some students in each of her classes, specifically it's the students that she asked in her classes, right? Bias. Can bias ever be a sample? No. Could it be a biased sample? Yes, which may be what some of us were thinking about. But when I say what is the actual sample, what is the sample? And again, this might be a descriptor. Could this be a convenience sample?
I thought it was just because she just went to her class instead of
It was convenient, right?
Yeah.
But notice the question is what is the sample, not what type of sample is
Yeah,
it.
that's.
So maybe that's something that comes up under what is the problem with this study? Well, she used convenience samples. Okay? Again, selection bias, is that the actual sample?
No.
Notice small detail here, students in her classes. Is it all the students in her classes? No, just the ones that she asked. Okay? Again, right here, average amount of sleep the students get. Is that the sample? Remember, the sample is just the people that she talks to. The average amount of sleep, that's a part of the characteristic of interest. We all get on those details to help us understand a little bit better. Finally, so she's curious, what type of study is this? So a couple of us identified what type of study this is. What do we see? I know we didn't all get there.
Observation.
Observational study. This is actually technically a subset of observational study called a survey, right? Because, and the difference is, remember when we went outside and we looked at the M&Ms on the ground, and we came inside and we observed the colors of M&Ms? That's an observational study. A survey is when you go and ask questions of people.
So it's a type of observation.
It is a type of observational study. And so I do want to clarify, I will accept observational study, but the specific type is a survey. Okay? So bias, some students may not get enough sleep as others. Is that an issue though, that some students may not get enough?
Yes.
Why is that an issue?
Well, not really an issue in the experiment, but to them.
I mean, like realistically though, do I want a prediction or a representation of the population, right? In the population, there are going to be some people who get less sleep than others.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay? So the issue wouldn't necessarily be that some students may not get enough sleep, but there is bias that came up in the earlier discussions that we saw. What type of bias is at play? Okay, so the type of sample is convenience sample, which may lead to bias. Selection bias. Is she getting random students? She's not even getting random students within her own classes, I don't think. She just asked some students. You gotta have randomization, and she needs more than just the students in her class. The students in her classes may be different than the rest. I assume, Lexi, most of the students in your classes are juniors? Could juniors have a different amount of sleep than seniors or freshmen or sophomores? Yes, right? So we want more than just those students in her classes. Are there any other types of bias that we might see here? Or any other issues? Okay, is it an issue that she's only doing it at Hillcrest High School?
Yeah, I mean,
not
yeah, because some
necessarily.
schools, like at ACA, I ain't getting no sleep. Because we had homework on
Some
it.
schools, yeah, they may give more homework, but
But-
that's not what she's
But look-
asking.
But
But
then the
that's not what
average
she's asking.
of-
What is she asking?
For Hillcrest High
For
School.
Hillcrest.
Students at Hillcrest High School. Do you want to go to other schools if we're only worried about Hillcrest High School?
No.
No, and so that's a good point, Bill Shannon, that's why we need to identify what is the population. She should only look at students at Hillcrest High School because that's what her question is. Does that make sense? Okay, and so there are always different populations that you can talk about. Here we're talking about Hillcrest High School students. We could have said Tuscaloosa City students, or Tuscaloosa County students, or Alabama students, but here we specified Hillcrest High School. Does that help clarify that detail? Okay. Alright, so questions off of the homework that we need to ask before we get started on today? Any from here, the assignment part? Yes?
Oh, not that one, never mind.
Okay. this is mostly just matching definitions. I was hoping that this would be pretty straightforward. Any of these that we have questions about? I assume some of the experiment stuff maybe, but if you read through the text, or what we read through in the textbook today will help clarify.
I mean, all the answers are like in the book.
We're in book 2.
And that's one thing I will say, like, all these answers for the right portion are in the book, but are there any here that were like, hey, that was unclear? Or what does that mean?
What page is this on?
The
In
one
5-73, I believe.
used kinda was like G and H were like the last ones I did.
G and H,
So, like, the
experiment
treatment
versus
one?
treatment. So what do you think,
But like it made sense like once I got down to it.
right, so process elimination will help you get there. So where do you think experiment went?
8.
8. So a process that gathers data on the effect of one or more treatments on the characteristic of interest, right? That's an experiment. It's a type of study, and we are talking about those treatments, which I've used that word a couple times to clarify when we talk about a treatment. That is the different combinations of independent variables to see how they affect the dependent variable. And then what do you put for treatment?
7.
7. An experimental condition that is used on treatment groups, right? So when we say that experimental condition, that means the different combinations of independent variables. By the way, like I'm giving you all free answers here. If you don't have those two answered, that would be a good thing to have there. Hopefully we've already done this, but if you haven't, okay? Chicago, were you about to say something earlier before I accidentally cut you off?
Oh, it's after we did the purple sheet.
No, this is the textbook, M5-73.
Oh yeah, are we supposed to do the purple sheet?
That's due Monday.
Okay.
Remember, the big ideas from the purple sheet are due Monday. Someone in my third block did bring up that there's some type of bias, under coverage bias on there. Don't worry about that one. I decided not to cover that. Like I talked about it yesterday, but it's not a focus for me. And it won't be on your test or quiz. Okay. All right.
My questions don't start until 2.
I don't understand the lesson part on the purple sheet. Are you supposed to write out a lesson or?
Not write out a lesson, just identify what lesson you learned about those ideas. Right. Like, where did we first learn about bias? Well, that was the imminent activity, right?
I just looked up.
So identify, and guys, please listen, the reason why there's that lesson portion of the vocab sheet and big idea sheet is then you can say, okay, if I need to restudy about bias, then I can go to this activity where I have notes about it,
Yeah.
or more details, okay? So it's to help you organize your thoughts. So you had a question about number 2?
2B. I just didn't know like what to put. Like I know how to get a random sample, but like how would
You're
you
organizing a survey to learn about the exercise habits of students in your school. You are interested to know the number of hours students spend exercising during an average week.
It's
And
kinda
so
like-
we're gonna kind of address this more heavily tomorrow, but what's the only thing we've done to get a random sample?
put them in a generator?
So we do a random number generator, and so we needed on the average word length one, we needed each word to have a what?
A number?
A number associated with it, right? So something here is we could say assign each person a number. And use a random number generator. So if you ever see me write RNG, and you can do this as well, RNG is just a random number generator. And use a random number generator to generate, it doesn't say how many students, but we'll say blank number of students. Alright, so you're just going to assign each person a number, use a random number generator to generate blank number of students.
Can I write this on paper? Instead of-
I mean,
It's from
you can. Just make sure you turn in that sheet with it as well. Okay.
And then I had one about 3C.
3 what?
C.
See? So a medical researcher wants to determine whether there is a connection between the frequency of migraine headaches in adults and changes in weather, right? Before I even read any further, that question, is that going to be an observational study or is that an experiment?
An experiment.
Okay, so notice how we are trying to establish maybe a cause and effect, but there are also times when we could just establish that there is a correlation, right? And so if we're just looking at a correlation and not cause and effect, then it would just be an observational study, but that's why it's important to understand the goals of the two differences. But notice it does talk about confounding here, so probably an experiment, but let's read a little bit further. The researcher collects data on 75 adults who experience migraine headaches that live in temperate climates and 75 adults who experience migraine headaches that live in climates with varying extremes. Looking at that, did the researcher apply treatments or did they just observe?
They observe.
They just observed, right? This is an observational study. So we can find a correlation, a prediction about the population, but we cannot establish cause and effect because there is confounding. Does that make sense?
So what is the population of interest? Like, because it can't be the 75 adults who experience migraines.
Yeah, no, the 75 adults who
That's the
experience
sample.
migraines
That'd be a sample, wouldn't
in
it?
temperate climates versus those with varying extremes, that's the what?
Sample.
Sample, right?
I think
And so
that-
really it's the 150 adults with migraines in those climates.
For A, I just put adult.
Wait,
That
that's
might be
the
wrong.
sample, but what's the, oh, is that the population of interest? Or
No,
is
that's
that-
the sample.
Yeah, so
So what are they trying to make a prediction about? Not just adults
who have migraines?
who have migraines.
Okay, but
Right.
in temperate climates and versus the other one, or
No,
that's
just-
okay.
Adults who have migraines. Yep. Alright. So the question is, how could confounding be avoided or addressed? Well, this is only an observational study, so we can't establish, or we can't, address confounding. So what kind of study would we have to conduct to address the confounding?
An experiment.
An experiment, right? And so what we could do is we could assign, which we would need to randomly, but we could randomly assign adults to those climates. Is that realistic?
Mm-hmm. Or no,
Can you tell someone, hey, go live in this area?
no.
No, probably not.
But if they chose to be part of the study, like, it couldn't be random, but random people would have to be like, yeah, I'm up for it, and then they would move you to a different climate.
So, well, and so please notice, like, you don't have to have random people, but you have to have people and then randomly assign those people.
Oh, so
'Cause if
that's,
you
so
ran
if
it-
they have headaches, like, if they just have to have headaches, that's the only, like, requirement.
Right, because that's the only people we're studying. If you randomly select people, you're gonna reduce bias, and then you could actually also make a prediction about a population.
Mhm.
So you can actually make predictions about populations and establish cause and effect if you both apply treatments and you reduce bias. Okay? So anything else we could do? I don't really see anything else.
Number 4, did we just put what bias is?
So explain how each sampling method is biased. So yes, identify the type of bias that's at play, but also make sure you write about it in context.
Yeah.
Don't just say, hey, there's selection bias. There is selection bias because this group of people are ignored, or only this group of people are selected.
I gotta write that different thing.
Yeah, if you need extra room,
So
yes.
basically just explaining like why it's biased.
Correct. That's, yeah. So explain how or explain why each sample is biased. So identify the type of bias at play, and then make sure you write about it in context. Any other questions before we get started with today?
So when you say, like, the write about it in context, is that because we turn this into you? Because if we do that, I might put my like answers somewhere else, so, and, or will we like show it to you and can I point it out?
So, what Shannon was asking about, and I think KJ is saying the same thing, is write on a separate sheet of paper and just turn in both papers together.
I don't know, but I'm gonna lose them. I just already know, it, like, the book is like secure, but I can like write answers, but I'll know what they are.
So you know you can tear it out, and then it's got hole punch, or it's already hole punch, so you can put it in your notebook.
Yeah,
That's what I would recommend.
I know, but I'm saying I'm gonna lose the paper that I write the answers on, cause that's just like my
But
look.
that's also hole punch, just put in the textbook together,
Oh.
and then it'll be okay. Any other last questions before we get started?
Can I turn in my math literacy?
Today?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just hand it to me as you're
Yeah,
walking
I
out.
already turned mine into you, right, after school one day, I came by and turned it into you, and then.
I don't think
I
so.
have it. I've had it for like a while. I thought I turned it in.
Yeah. Oh yeah, does anyone else have their student release forms to turn in? I haven't put these grades in, but I am gonna do this soon.
Do you want my mom's really extra printouts that she did for me to analyze the data or no?
No.
I mean,
Let's say it's due Friday, okay? But also at the same time, I mostly just need them, right?
I'll work it later for you.
Huh? Oh, the math, yes, the homework is due tomorrow, yes, sorry. So you're talking about the release forms, alright? Guys, the release form should be a nice, easy grade. And that is actually one thing I probably should quickly address grade-wise. I know some of us are freaking out about our grades. One, I do want to remind you, by definition, and I know this is not the mentality, especially in advanced courses, but if you have an A, what that means is you have an excellent mastery or understanding of the content.
What we got?
Okay? That's what an A literally means. A B means you have a strong mastery of the content. So you need to think about where you are on that. If you need to come into tutoring, then come into tutoring. If you have a C, that means it's an average level of understanding. There's this thing called grade inflation in schools that is a major issue, which is why a lot of us are used to only having A's or only having B's, or A's and B's. But I'm not going to inflate your grades because your grade needs to reflect what you have completed and what you understand. As I said though, some of us are missing assignments, and so I'm going to make that Excel sheet that's identifying, actually a Google sheet is what I'm going to do. I'm going to share it with everybody today so you can see if there's any assignments you're missing. But if you are concerned also about your grade, you have test corrections. Those test corrections can bring you up to a 79. You take a retest, if you make 100, you make 100. Okay? So if you are going to have trouble getting those test corrections done this week in tutoring, you need to come talk to me, but we need to get that taken care of. Okay? I want you to be successful, but you gotta put in the work as well.
I'm proud of my math grades, better than my last ones.
That's good.
I'm not.
And that's, I will say that, like, I know some of, and that's, I am crazy, I'm different, I'm tough, but students who work for me will find a lot of success in my class. If you stay awake, if you do your work, you're gonna be successful.
That's the problem. That every year, my worst class is always my first one because I'm not awake for this. You guess what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying?
Alright, we're gonna get started with Carnegie Learning 1.2 Observational Studies and Experiments. We'll move into 3.7 and 3.9 by the end of class. We'll have to move through those quickly. So remember, we are studying experiments, and the whole thing with experiments is we're trying to establish what in an experiment? What are we trying to establish in an experiment?
Whatever you're trying to
Prevent confounding.
Not trying to make a prediction, that's an observational study. What are we trying to establish in an experiment?
Cause and effect.
There we go, cause and effect, right? What can prevent us from establishing cause and effect?
Confounding.
Confounding, right? So we need to be aware that that confounding can be a major issue because that's a variable that we can't account for that may actually be the cause. Yesterday, we looked at the matches in people's pockets, right? And people who have matches in their pocket typically have more cancer. Well, Is that because of the matches, or is it because they're probably smoking?
Because that's
Probably smoking, right? That smoking is a confounding variable that's not directly there. Is there a correlation between matches and cancer? That just means there's a relationship. When I say correlation, all I'm saying is that there's a relationship. But it's not necessarily causation. And that's what we need to keep in mind. So, getting into 1.2, I want you to go ahead and start working within your group to read through this. This is M5-69 or so, I think. So read through this, start answering the questions. I want to try to get through this in the next 10 to 15 minutes because we got other stuff we got to cover as well, so that we can get done with experiments. We're already like 3 days behind each
all the
portion.
way to 6,
Huh?
all the way to number 6, because we already did.
Yeah, it's the end of 1.2. Or, yeah. So finishing up 1.2. You don't have a copy of that book? Write your answers down on a separate sheet of paper.
And 5, 16.
Yeah, alphabet say looking for a progression.
Sample survey.
Yep. Do you have your textbook?
You're obtaining data
Like you left both of them?
from.
No, I think that oh, it says,
Oh, then that right there is probably yours.
really?
Yeah. Because that is a volume 2 that I had just laying around.
Yeah, so ask questions.
So here, I have another volume 2 out. Make sure you bring your volume 2 with you though when I need it, okay? So, because yeah, that was a volume 2 that was just left.
69, 68.
Oh, wait, I got it.
M5-69.
So, once we do
There you go.
What's the allocation?
Yes, ma'am.
100 patients.
Yeah, that's where we ended up, right? So similarities and differences between.
I thought this was homework.
We gotta go all the way to
Diagram, will show what they have in common. So what do we know they have in common?
similarities is collecting data.
And the actual.
Okay, so they, when you say getting results, maybe collecting data, right? So they're both collecting data, okay? But I feel like every kind of study or experiment would collect data, right? So what do they have in common maybe that's different than an experiment?
The end result, is that different?
Let's wake up, but
Like,
let me stop recording.